Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Claire Fenello, and today EVCOM are delighted to welcome Steve Garvey from Moving Image for the launch of his much anticipated brand film report. This is the first sight anyone in the industry will have had of it, so you'll be very much ahead of the curve, armed with the information that it'll be giving out. Before any introductions, can I just tell you a little bit about how the session will run? I will hand over to Steve, who will share a brief film and then talk a little bit about the report before opening up to the panel, who will then discuss some of the points raised. We would encourage you to ask questions. Please, can you post your questions into the chat function, where they will then be directed to the facilitator to field to the panel, which will be taking us up to about 4:45. Please do ask questions, because this is an ideal opportunity to be able to discuss it with the people who are instigating the report. The facilitator will be Patrick Russell from the BFI, and he is joined by Steve Garvey and James Bennett from Televisual. I will now pass you over to Steve, who will begin the proceedings, and I will reappear after he's delivered some of the information, and we'll take it from there. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you very much, Claire, and good afternoon, everybody. I think we've got a pretty good turnout on this, though, of course, I can't actually see you, which is a great shame. So we're looking forward to this very much today to talk about the brand film sector and how and why it's been hidden. But before we go any further talking about brand film, let's actually see a brand film. So, Chris, if you wouldn't mind cueing the video now, please.
Hello, I'm a broadcaster.
Hi, I'm from the world of brand film.
We give the nation a voice in the world.
And we give brands a voice in the world.
Yes, but we inform, educate, and entertain.
So do we.
But we have history.
We made Night Mail.
We broadcast to a worldwide audience.
So do we.
On TV, online, on mobile, and on iPlayer.
Yeah, on TV, online, on mobile, and on any player.
We televised the brilliant London Olympics.
We made the brilliant film that won London the Olympics.
We employ thousands of creatives and top talent.
Likewise, some of the very same top talent.
You do? Well, we build trust.
We build trust in brands.
Of course, we are inspired storytellers.
And we have to tell inspired stories.
We do, though, quite rightly, have to justify the licence fee and advertising.
We don't do advertising.
We have to persuade the authorities and the audience of how good we are and how much good we do.
That's a brand film.
ROI, metrics, you know?
I do know. Marketing.
Not a word we use, but there are
messages you need to craft perfectly to engage your target audience.
We prefer to speak in terms of narrative.
Narratives are what we specialise in.
You do you?
We do. Maybe you need a brand film.
And I just want to thank Tim Langford and his crew, headed by Mark Wellband, for helping us with that particular brand film. Now, one of the reasons we decided to make a brand film was to get the message through. And despite the fact that this is a big, a dynamic, and hugely exporting sector, it's just not on the radar as far as the UK film and TV industry is concerned. And I'm afraid we really only have ourselves to blame for that to a large degree, because we've not done the research for 15 years. So today we're going to fix that. And I hope that in the process, we're going to fix getting this kind of expression, like we got from Hal, who was the actor who played the broadcaster in our film there. Because when people ask me at social events, whatever, what I do and I try and explain, I often get this kind of look, which is bafflement, slight amusement maybe. And if they do get what I'm talking about, they probably think of this, and they probably think of the phrase corporate video, and they probably say, oh, you mean corporate videos? So in order for us to move on and give ourselves a proper and updated identity and narrative for our sector, we've got to go out there and find out about ourselves. So that's really what led us to do the work to generate this particular report, which is largely based on the survey that many of you filled in last winter, and thank you so much for doing that. Without it, we certainly couldn't have had anything like we've got today. Because what we want to do is to be able to say, well, look at this. This will explain what this sector is all about. And this sector, it's really been a very collaborative process. Of course, we've been working closely with EVCOM, with the BFI in the form of Patrick in particular, but also with some input from their research team. And James at Televisual has provided constant updates on the sector over the years with the Corporate 50. But then also I want to just make a quick mention of the European Union because their Fund for Regional Development co-funded this project along with Moving Image and helped us get access to the academic expertise of the University of Essex. So that's been pulling together from the institutional side, and then all of you in the sector have made a real difference by providing us with your data. So please carry on doing that when we repeat this exercise over the coming winter. So to come up with some data and a sort of narrative for this sector, you've got to decide what it is. How do you define it? So we came up with 3 criteria, and all of these have to be fulfilled for the kind of thing that we're looking into to be qualified as brand film. And just a quick word on the phrase. Personally, I never really use the phrase corporate video anymore. I used to 20 years ago, but not now. We use phrases like brand film, brand video, corporate film. They're all the same kind of thing for us. Now, the first criterion that has to be fulfilled is that the data can't have been captured somewhere else already. There's many excellent research projects already taking place into the UK screen industries. Excellent. What we want to find is what's been missing. So we don't want anything that's been in any of the reports by those kind of organisations. Secondly, it has to be paid for, whether commissioned out or actually produced in-house, by either a commercial brand or a public sector body, like a government department or something which is funded by government, or a not-for-profit organisation. If it's been funded by a video platform or a broadcaster, then obviously it doesn't qualify. And thirdly, the audience must get the content for free. And by that, I don't just mean not paying for tickets or not paying for a subscription, but also the audience must not be required to watch advertising to watch this piece of content. If it fulfills all of those 3, then we're interested. And of course, as you all know, or most of you anyway, who are on this webinar, that is everything in this list. It's pretty much everything that lots of organisations, both large and small, invest in for video apart from advertising. So the kind of things which are in that bullet point list there. Now let's just put this in context of the UK economy, and in particular of the creative industries. Now, since the 2012 Olympics, quite a lot of research has been done into the creative industries, particularly, and pulled together. And it's come up with this huge figure, which I've quoted here from the Creative Industries Federation report in 2018, of gross value added for the UK economy of £101 billion. And of course, that does not include brand video, because we didn't have the data at that point. And it always surprises people when I quote this and say that that is more than automotive, aerospace, life sciences, and gas and oil combined. So we may be creative, but collectively we're also a massive economic powerhouse. The UK screen industries, film, TV, they make up around 20 billion of that figure. So the question is, where does brand film sit within that? Well, we'll come to the numbers in a moment, but first of all, I think it's probably fair to say that it's big. It is definitely bigger than a lot of people on the outside might think. When we did the research, we decided to make it manageable at least to set the initial benchmark for the 2020 report, by focusing on production companies, because they're relatively easy to research in comparison to some of the other sectors that make up this industry. So when we did that work, we found that there were at least 1,000 production companies in this sector. Now, probably the number is a fair bit higher than that. And to actually qualify for this, a company has to have at least 50% of its revenue coming from brand film and video. So we know there are at least 1,000. There may well be 2,000 or more, but there's certainly at least 1,000 who fit into that category. And when you take all of their revenue together, that adds up to at least £750 million. And when you take the internal production teams which brands have, and people like videographers and freelancers who are not caught in either of those first two, then you're certainly going to be at well over £1 billion. Now, we can't be any more precise than that yet, because we need to add to the first layer of research that we've got in 2020 and make that more sophisticated and go further in 2021. But personally, this is just a feeling. It's going to be more than £1 billion. Who knows, it might be 1.5 or 2 billion, we don't know yet. But if that proved to be the case, then we'd be something like 5 to 10% of the size of the known UK TV and film industry before this piece of research came out. So, you know, Hal, who is in our film, he thinks of it as just a little offshoot. And sure, it's not as big as some of the other sectors within the industry, such as broadcast TV, which is around, I think, the 12 or 13 billion mark. But it's still a substantial sector of the screen economy in the UK. When you start to look at how that works for individual companies, you get an average turnover for a brand film production company of just over £2 million, £2.03 million. And that figure is only for brand films. So if we're looking at a production company that does, for example, 80% of its revenue in brand film and the rest is in live events, we're only counting the 80% which is in brand film. But the vast majority of that overall in the sector is with small businesses. There's only about 6% of companies in this sector that have a turnover of more than £10 million. So it is populated by small businesses, and over 40% are turning over no more than £500,000 a year. That, by the way, is reflected throughout the creative industries. You'll find this in all the creative industries and Creative England research, that there are a huge number of very small enterprises making up this very large total. In terms of people, well, the average production company, and when I say average, by the way, it's the mean, so the total amount of the figure that we got divided by the number of participants in that. And for the average production company, it's 11.6 people. This is full-time employees or full-time employee equivalents. So if you've got two people job sharing, that counts as one person. Those 11.6 people, to be honest, at the moment, we don't know too much about them. We know that there are some very well-educated people in there, because many production companies employ somebody with a postgraduate degree on their team somewhere. But we don't know much yet. We don't know anything yet about things like ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, faith, etc. We didn't ask those questions last year, so we'll add those in for 2021. And I think the events of 2020 have proven how necessary that is going to be. By the way, when you look at the in-house teams, never mind the external production companies, but the in-house teams inside the brands, they employ a similar number of people as full-time employees. It's 13.6 in their case, but pretty close to the production companies. The whole export market is very substantial within this sector. When we asked production companies if they'd worked for an overseas client in the past year, 82% of them said yes. And that's interesting for a number of reasons, but one of the main ones being that when the EVCOM, which was EVCOM's forerunner, asked the same question in 2005, only 25% of those said yes, they had exported in the previous year. So this has been a huge growth over the intervening 15 years. And those of us who've been around for a while may remember that after that report, the IVC launched a series of overseas trips to the Middle East and China and so on, and various other places. Who knows, maybe those made all the difference, or maybe it was great work by brand film producers in the UK building a global reputation for the kind of products and services that international brands can get from producers here. When you look at where those clients were based, there's an overwhelming predominance from Europe and the USA. Now, of course, there's a bit of a red flag there in terms of Brexit. Who knows, maybe even the US election might start to throw up trade barriers. We don't really know yet, but certainly those two areas could be subject to disruption, and we may see less revenue coming in 2021. So having produced the work for clients, whether they're in the UK or outside of the UK, there has been quite a shift in the way that work is typically used. So I know this looks like a ridiculously busy and complicated chart, but it's actually very simple. If you go over to the left, that's the most popular and most important usage of brand film work, and the ones on the right are the least important ones. So it does show there's a very clear divide here between the brand film sector and other sectors of the UK screen industry. So you can see, for example, that advertising, broadcast, cinema and consumer video platforms are the least important channels for delivering work that's been produced by brand filmmakers. But over on the left, you've got social media was either the first or second most important channel for brand film producers, for 74% of brand film producers. And if we'd asked that question 5 years ago, I'm sure that would have been a nice to have rather than a must have. But digital in the form of social websites and mobile is the primary driver of brand film production now. We captured most of our data from production companies, but we did get some data as well from brands. So we've shared a little bit of this, although I should stress it's a smaller sample. And the average amount that was reported as being spent by a brand on brand video was £750,000 a year. Now, we should be a little bit cautious with this for the simple reason that I think most of us know that within the brands, it's very hard to find anyone who knows what that entire brand spends on video. If it's a smaller business, then it's much easier to find out. But if it's a global enterprise, probably nobody really knows what that figure is. So that may well be an underestimate of the amount that's spent. And that amount, that £750,000, includes both the cost of running an in-house team and all the expenses which are associated with that, plus commissioned out work to production companies. The good news is, although this, of course, all this data was gathered pre-COVID, so things may be very different now, we don't know yet, but 75% of the brands that we spoke to said that they expected to make more video in the next year and the coming year than the past one. The bad news is that, as you may have expected, about half of those, only about half that number expected budgets to increase in line with the video production output. So as I'm sure as many of us experienced, brands are going to continue to want more for the same or not much more. The good news is, though, there wasn't any sign, at least last winter, and we captured all of our data just before the lockdown started, but there wasn't any sign then that video was going to be needed less, and arguably the COVID-19 pandemic may have actually driven it in the opposite direction. So I've just shared with you a few really brief main headlines out of the full report. It's actually a 50-page report. There's loads and loads more in it. But I just wanted to urge you, when we email you over the winter and say, please, would you complete the survey, to continue to offer your data, because we've got a load of questions that may come up. I just stuck this together with some of the questions that I might want to ask about what the situation is like for our sector at the beginning of 2021. But it's by spending that 15 minutes that you make this that you guys who work in the sector make it possible for us to be able to create this identity for us all. I'm going to hand over now back to Claire, but just before I go, after this webinar, I think it may be tomorrow morning, EVCOM are going to circulate an email, a post-event email. There'll be a link in that. So if you want a copy of the report, you follow that link and decide which option you wish to go for. Thanks very much, and back to Claire.
Thanks very much, Steve. Lots and lots of information in that report. We'll now pass over to Patrick Russell, who will facilitate a conversation between himself, Steve, and James Bennett. This is an ideal time for you to start posting questions into the chat function, and we'll make sure that Patrick gets those. But hopefully some interesting questions will be raised right now in the conversation. So we'll kick off. Patrick, do you want to just do a quick overview of what you've just seen and heard?
Yes, thank you, Claire, and thank you, EVCOM and Moving Image, for inviting me to facilitate this discussion part of the webinar. I'm very honoured. I'm going to make a couple of brief remarks myself before I hand over to James and Steve, and I will be chairing a discussion between them. And then in a few minutes' time, we'll go to audience questions. As Claire has said, if you could send those in through chat, they will then be fed through to me, and I'll take them in roughly the order that they come. From my vantage point in the BFI, I would consider myself as being an interested and sympathetic observer of the corporate film sector for quite a lot of years. I tend to bring a historical perspective to things, and I think that might be relevant in terms of understanding why this report is necessary and what it needs to do and does begin to do. In the ultimate roots of this industry, your great-grandparents, as it were, in corporate filmmaking, government filmmaking, charity and third sector filmmaking, goes right the way back to very near the beginning of cinema itself. Films were being commissioned by these kind of organizations back in Edwardian times, but your direct roots go back to the 1980s, essentially. Steve referred to this, the corporate video industry. And at this point, what was referred to as the industrial or the sponsored film that was very, very strong in the mid-20th century died as celluloid died as a technology for this sort of use. And videotape technology really caused a phoenix to rise from the ashes, and that was the corporate video industry. The reason why I think this is significant in terms of interpreting the report that Steve has just so skillfully summarized is that a great legacy that I think your industry has from those beginnings in the 80s is the kind of entrepreneurial, adventurous startup spirit in which an industry was created, as I say, from the ashes. And I think that adventurousness and that entrepreneurialism is still present in your industry today. The downside of it, I think, was that whereas the industrial films of the 20th century, the people who made those, they were very much seen as part of the film industry. They were all part of the film union. Their films were all processed in the same laboratories, etc. Whereas to some extent, I think the corporate video industry was slightly, this isn't too true across the board, was slightly hermetically sealed from other film and TV sectors. And I think there's been a legacy from that in terms of the industry, as Steve has said, not being sufficiently understood from the outside, being underrated, and not really punching with the weight that it really has developed now, as it should, amongst the key creative screen industries. It really should be up there, out and proud, with television, with advertising, with video games, and with cinema. And one of the challenges in the way of that is the fact that there's so much about this industry that just isn't understood. And I think this report is a great step towards it being better understood. It answers some of the questions. It raises a lot more questions. So I would see this as being a milestone within a process that may run for many years. And I congratulate Steve and Moving Image for making it possible. So I'm going to turn now to my panelists, Steve himself and James Bennett, who's the founder and managing director of Televisual, also a long-time observer of the corporate or brand films scene, although coming at it from a slightly different perspective than mine. Perhaps, James, I could start by asking you to sum up your first thoughts on the report and any questions that you might like to put back to Steve.
I do. I have a number of questions. One of the challenges I always think with the corporate video market, or let's call it the brand film industry, which I infinitely prefer as a piece of badging. And Steve, if we can carry that one forward, and indeed with EVCOM, I think that would be a good thing. The first thing I have is really that there's, for me, from where I sit, there seems to be a lot of about 100 visible companies making corporate video or brand films. And yet within your extrapolation, Steve, you've given us a figure of 1,000 plus companies contributing 750 million before we go into the in-house and the videographers. I'd like to ask you a little bit more about how you reach those figures, because I see 100 large organizations and they tail off quite quickly when we do our corporate 50, our top 50 in terms of turnover. How do you reach those figures, Steve?
There's a bunch of ways of doing it. You're absolutely right. On our own website, we've got a directory and that's got about 230 companies in it. So certainly in terms of the known entities and, should we say, recognized players, there are a small number of hundreds. But I think what that misses out is that there's actually, there is a very strong focus at the moment, certainly the data that we captured of film productions being in London and the Southeast. But I think there are a lot of film production companies throughout the whole of the UK, and some of them are very small indeed. So you wouldn't even necessarily know that they exist. The one place that you can definitely find out whether they do exist is with this rather arcane thing called the SIC codes at Companies House. That when you set up a company, you have to say what kind of company it is. And one of those categories that you can choose is called video production. And we found that with the respondents in our survey, which is about 120 different industry leaders gave us their data, we found that there was at 47% of the companies that reported, we tracked it back to Companies House, and we found that 47% used that video production SIC code. The second most popular one was film production, which you can also choose, but only 16% of those chose film production. We got a pretty good span, both the larger companies and the smaller companies, down to companies which are doing films for very, very low budgets indeed. So we looked at that, and then we looked at the number of companies that are categorized as video production, which is made public through tax records and so on, by the Office for National Statistics. And there's a huge number. The last figures I had, I think, were 2017, and there were nearly 3,000 of them classified as video production, and they also had and they were growing extremely fast in terms of number. Their revenues, they reported, were growing fast, but the number of companies that were being created was growing even faster. Now, many of these are going to be very small companies, basically one-person bands probably, or one or two people bands. But if they're choosing video production, and we know that roughly half of our sample is categorized as video production, then let's face it, they're not making big budget series for Netflix. So they're very likely, or at least some of them are very likely to be in that sector. So we felt that by overlaying the data that way, we could be pretty confident that we were only picking up in our research directly, that we were only picking up a sample of the whole. But I do take the point, James, that it's at this stage a slightly speculative number, and it's something that we will do a lot more work on for the 2021 report. And what this means really is going out and finding them by multiple data sets and by engaging with them, because believe me, once you get outside a kind of bubble that I feel that I live in London, there are loads and loads of companies who don't really have any idea that what we do here actually exists. They're just getting on with their own work.
And if I can,
Steve, can I come up with a follow-up question to that one, actually, guys? Steve, another part of the screen industry's family of sectors that's been taking a growing interest in brand film in recent times is the advertising industry. You very rightly kind of drew a line in your presentation between advertising as a form and brand film as a form. But given your focus on production companies, I wondered whether, in terms of future developments arising from this report, that some consideration of how the advertising industry is going into the brand films field would be an interesting area to explore.
And Steve, if I can, I was going to come at exactly that, which is that, you know, not only the advertising agencies, but particularly the digital agencies, as they call themselves. And, you know, every single ad agency I know of is now doing brand films to some degree or another. And that crossover between the two is sometimes tangential between brand funded or brand content. And then at the same time as that, you also have, for example, as a publishing company, I was turning over 2/3 on corporate video at one point, going back in time, on brand films. And again, I wouldn't be picked up by your survey. So just matter of factly, I think on the one hand, your survey as taking one group. On the other hand, I think there's other groups that you can bring in. And the challenge you have, and we talked about this back in Knightsbridge, what, 3 years ago? The challenge you have is identifying, you know, how that fits together. And
it is. It really is like the classic trying to nail jelly to a wall. But a couple of observations. You have to work at it, and you have to work out ways that you can make it make sense. Now, one of the things that I would emphasise is with the advertising agencies that do brand films, there are 2 points to make there. One is that they already report their data through organisations like the Internet Advertising Bureau, for example. So their data is already captured and treated as advertising. But we don't want to double report that, so we're leaving that alone. The second point is that this really is a market for specialists. Perhaps the most telling statistics I can show with that is that if you look at the PACT survey, the Trade Association for Independent Producers in sort of broadcast and factual and entertainment space, it's really dramatic that if you look at their survey, they've been running since 2008. They used to have quite substantial revenues from corporate, as they labelled it, and since about 2013, 2014, that has declined steadily until where 2019, it was just £5 million spread across the entire industry, which is the turnover of 2.5 brand film companies. So those guys used to dip into this market, presumably to fill in gaps or to make some extra revenue. And these days, they don't. That may be because, James would know better than me, there's loads of work from Netflix coming in these days, or it might just be because it's become so immensely competitive in the brand film sector, it's just not worth their while. And for that reason, you're also seeing some of the digital and ad agencies are outsourcing work to brand film specialists, because you've got to be really, really, really focused in this sector to do well, and in some cases even to stay afloat.
If I can, and one of the things I'd comment on there is if you go back to the origins of the UK independent production sector in 1982, with the birth of Channel 4, which became a publisher contractor rather than a siloed organisation like the BBC or ITV. At that point, a lot of the people who flooded in were actually what would be called then corporate production companies, who became hybrids working on both corporate and broadcast. And they became a home for disaffected BBC producers, particularly coming out and setting up shop, you know, when they first came out and first started doing that. There was a lot of crossover between the two. There's no doubt that the amount has diminished and diminished and diminished. I know of very few production companies that are actively making corporate. And those that I do tend to have two brands or run two companies side by side nowadays, Steve, one of which would define itself as doing brand film, and the other one which would define itself as doing broadcast production, which I think is all to do with presentation when going out and pitching to the likes of the BBC, ITV, or indeed Netflix.
Makes sense.
Steve, a question for you coming from a different angle. Did your report look at all at the types of projects and the types of clients who are funding most of the work that these production companies are doing, and the breakdown between the different sectors that you mentioned, government and public sector, corporate and third sector or NGOs?
Yes and no. We did gather, we asked about two main things in terms of the content itself. One of those, that was the channel slide which I put up. Which channels does your work get used on? The other one was which business unit or business purpose, is probably a better way of putting it, actually pays for it. And we wanted to do that, trying to make sure that we weren't just duplicating all the advertising work. And actually, in that piece of research, advertising barely got mentioned at all. So it's been commissioned for purposes which are primarily about marketing. There's also a huge amount of internal communications. There's a huge amount of training. There's health and safety. There's financial, and so on. So that's the yes bit. The no bit, we did not then do, as it were, like a three-dimensional analysis. I think that would be where we looked at how that works between different types of brands, whether they're commercial brands or public sector. And I think really, because we didn't get a very large data set from the brands, I don't think that would have been a very productive exercise. You can be sure that over the winter, we'll be looking for much more data from that side, because now we've got the production company data starting to build up. We need to go back to the brands to get more out of them.
As we've observed, this is the first survey of any kind at all, really, of this nature, above and beyond, obviously, the top 50, which is invaluable, that James publishes each year since 2005. So you're filling a vacuum, and I think it's a great start. We're about to move to questions from the floor, the virtual floor, but I thought perhaps before we turn to those, a question for both of you, really, in terms of what Steve has presented and what is in the report. If either of you could share either the thing that was was there anything that was a light bulb moment for you in terms of the metrics that this report has come up with? Anything that either you were delighted confirmed what you'd always suspected to be the case, or alternatively something that was a surprise, pleasant or unpleasant? James, you want to come in, I think?
I'd like to go first. I think one of the pleasant surprises was that far from the doomsters, there was a sense that there was a sense going back in time that the brand film community was going to be diminished by in-house and the idea of the PD, the editor, the one man with his GH5 or his A7S going in who could edit on Premiere and just kiboshing that industry. One of the things which I think is really reassuring is that that industry has shown and is showing steady growth as a professional, as professional businesses that make good profit. This is borne out in our corporate 50 as well. I think that's significant, and I think Steve's survey and the tracking nature of that survey iterates that very, very closely. I think it's one of the most reassuring aspects, and there is real tangible growth being demonstrated within it. I think that in itself is valuable, and this idea of a professional community and professional businesses, dedicated businesses fulfilling that role. Steve.
Yeah, thank you, James. No, I would agree that. I think at the moment, of course, it's very easy to be gloomy. Let's face it, the world is a pretty scary place currently. Although it may sound flippant, and I know it's very difficult for a lot of people, and I know there have been redundancies in companies, and I'm sure there'll be more to come. But I think the key point here is that, number one, there is demand for video. Okay, we have to figure out different ways of making it, and the production company model, which depends heavily on fees for doing those location shoots, that's under threat. That needs to be restructured. But we haven't got a problem that so many other industries have got right now, which is that nobody wants our stuff anymore, or nobody can get our stuff anymore. In fact, if anything, the opposite is true. So it's up to those of us who work in the sector to figure out ways to present this to the brands where it's a really compelling offer, which takes the place of something else that they might be doing something else and still delivers those business results, which is why it gets paid for in the first place. The other thing I'll quickly point out is that I was surprised by the level of exports. Genuinely surprised. I know, of course, I've done a million international jobs like everybody else has, but I was really surprised at that very high percentage who said yes to doing exports. And this is clearly something which we need to try to take to government, particularly in the Brexit era, to demonstrate that we've got a really good export success story, even though we're a bunch of really small companies, And as somebody said, I think it was Dagmar Mackett said from DRP said that the Made in Britain brand really works for selling this stuff internationally. And Dagmar is, of course, German by birth, so she knows what she's talking about.
I'd go slightly further again, Steve, and say that although budgets are obviously diminishing across the board, marketing budgets, communications budgets, one of the things that I'm hearing more and more is that those budgets are being diverted to more traditional avenues in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, and are going towards, we're seeing it in magazine revenues, but it was also, that's certainly the case in terms of video and structured video as against, and the irony I know is not lost on most of you, as against Zoom, and where there's a Zoom fatigue kicking in, and where structured, well-structured, to the point messaging has ever increasing value. I imagine that those revenues will actually grow over the the next 9 months to come, despite the fact that communications budgets are likely to diminish now that people are getting back, if you like, back to work and trying to get on with things.
Well, speaking of Zoom, I have questions piling up from the audience in the Zoom chat facility. So I'll take them in the order to which they've come to me. The first question comes from Emily. She asks, this is a question clearly for you, Steve, how many brands did you speak to? And did they all have in-house teams?
With the brands, I think we spoke to about 30 brands, if I recall correctly, and they were all major brands. And they were, did they all have in-house teams? It depends what you mean by an in-house team, Emily. They certainly all have people inside their business working on video. But there is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all inside a brand for a team. You know, we had teams of 2 people and we had teams of 50 plus people working inside brands. So it's extremely diverse. And I think one of the things that struck me about this as well, that because they said they do about 35% of their video output through their in-house team, that leaves quite a lot of work to go to be outsourced, which is back to the point I made originally, that this is a market for specialists because it is very, very different to many other parts of the UK screen industries.
The £750,000 annual spend by brands feels like it's a figure that might benefit from a lot more unpacking and future kind of under the bonnet work, because there are so many variables there, aren't there?
Yeah, there are. It's a very moving target and probably a very low estimate of what the large brands would be spending. They'll be spending millions at least on this kind of work.
So the next question comes from Dagmar, who was mentioned earlier. Hi, Dagmar. She asks, I have a horrible feeling this is possibly a question for me because it's a kind of an historical question, but you will both have perspectives on this as well. When and how did corporate film become a dirty word? Maybe I'll let you guys go on this first, and then if I've got anything
I think this is one for James. I wouldn't like to comment.
Okay. James, go for it.
Okay.
Give us a concise and compelling answer to this really interesting question.
I think it's the word corporate rather than corporate video that became the dirty word. Corporate and corporatism have negative connotation within the UK. I don't think they necessarily do overseas. I think it's a UK perspective. So that would be my first answer. And my second answer is that it became synonymous with the worst aspects of corporate video going back in time. And the papering over the cracks, perhaps, of, I don't know, a mining giant or otherwise. I personally, the word corporate has a negative connotation. Corporate lawyer, does that sound like an attractive person to be? You know, the word corporate has negative connotations across the spaces, not just within this. And we all prefer the word business, don't we, to corporate?
Thanks, James. I guess I will just add briefly, I agree with everything that you've just said. I will say, in the 1930s, making corporate films was cool. They weren't called corporate films at that time, but it was seen as being, if you wanted to make films that were really, going deep into society, describing the working world, and producing good civic education, then it was a very cool alternative to the commercial film industry. I think I would add to what James has said regarding the 1980s. I'd said before in my earlier remarks that I admire the kind of the can-do entrepreneurialism of that time, but another flip side of that was the fact that because a lot of those people who were doing that starting up were creating an industry from scratch, they kind of had to learn filmmaking from scratch using a new technology, videotape. And the result was that quite a lot of the work that was produced wasn't that good and was kind of, to use a 1980s word, naff. Everybody in this webinar knows that the technical and the creative standards of this industry are now high, but I think it's still belaboring a little bit under that brand image for corporate video, for the reasons that James and I have both outlined. We need to move fairly swiftly on so that we don't allow this webinar to run too far beyond time. We have a question from Sarah who asks, what can we do as an industry to raise our profile? How does the industry stay relevant post-COVID when, as we've observed in earlier parts of this session, commissioner budgets are so tight? So Steve, do you want to take that one first? And briefly both, if you may, as we're running a little close to time now.
Very simply, we need to pull together. I would say that in this sector, I've always been struck all the time that I've worked in it by the fact, although there's always been the IBC on our, the IBCA or EVCOM, when I went to my first IVCA event, it was in 1990, and there were about 400 people there. It was at the summer conference in Bournemouth, and everybody went away for the weekend. I mean, that is unimaginable now, never mind COVID, that's unimaginable. So I would like us to find ways to get everybody involved in this, because we've now got some kind of data set, albeit it's still a fairly limited one to sort of rally around. But we need, all those smaller companies, as well as the well-established players who are well known, to start to pull together in the same direction. And hopefully everyone can do that through EVCOM, which is the obvious channel for us to sort of put our efforts into.
Okay, so I think we have some time. James, do you want to come in on that one very quickly?
I think so too. I think it is something that has a status issue, and I think it's something that we should have a degree of pride in. And I love the idea that we all move forward collectively and call it brand film. I think it's a preferred expression. We debated this 4 years. It was 4 years ago, Steve. We debated it back then, and I think it would be lovely to bring that idea up. Brand film sounds much sexier than corporate. So let's move it on to that. And my apologies for using the term earlier. I'd like us to start using brand film, and we will start doing that next year. So that's agreed.
Personally, I still like industrial films as a term, but I'm pretty retro that way. I'll go with brand film. That's not a bad piece of terminology. So the next question is from Nina, who asks, will production companies get squeezed out by brands' internal teams? Again, a topic we've covered before.
Just a very quick answer, no. It's not going to happen, no way. I've seen this go back and forth for 30 years. A new technology comes along, a new way of doing stuff, a new head of communications, whatever, a new chief executive, and the pendulum swings, whether it's either outsourcing or not. Don't forget that large corporates love outsourcing. It keeps their balance sheet clean and keeps their cost base flexible. So production companies just, most productions are just far too good at what they do. Although the internal videographer or a team of people does fulfill a great need, which is for the constant need that every single business unit increasingly has video for everything that they do, every event they host, every social media channel they have. That's what they're going to do, but that doesn't mean that the production company will be squeezed out and cease to exist.
James, if you could answer, I implore you to be painfully brief.
I'd absolutely agree. I think outsourcing is something where you need a specific skill at a specific time. You yourselves in turn are outsourcing to individuals to do specific skills, specific times. The whole of the UK production ecology, be it independent production, film production does the same. It's full of very gifted, very talented, very niche skills. And those skills are in demand for short periods of time rather than an ongoing basis.
Thank you both. I would love to keep going all afternoon, but we must not outstay our welcome, and we should adhere to the first rule of show business, which is to leave them wanting more. I think both of you will agree, and everyone listening will agree, that, as I said at the beginning, this report, which makes fascinating reading and is a really outstanding piece of work, is a milestone within a process, and that process will have many years yet to run. So, as I said, this report answers some questions, but it poses lots more questions, and it'll be so fascinating in the years to come to see some of those questions get answered. Thank you all for listening to Steve, James, and myself, and I'm now going to hand back to Claire to wrap up the event. Thanks again.
Thank you, Patrick.
And if I could also then thank Patrick for hosting that very, very wonderfully. Thank you so much. Before we all depart, could I just flag a few things? We've got another webinar next week where we're going to get some advice and expert opinion around recruitment and skills for our sectors going forward. That's on the 21st of October at 4. I would also like to do a wee plug for the EVCOM London Live and Film Awards ceremony, which is going to be virtual this year on the 19th of November. Tickets going on sale very soon, and also supported by some background information on that. So we hope you'll be able to join us for that. I would also like to remind you that we will be sending out an email to everybody who was part of this discussion or taking part in the webinar, providing a link to accessing the brand in whatever the brand report in whatever format you'd care to do so. But just from a personal point of view, from EVCOM, I would like to say I do think that report gives a clear indication that the sector is in a very good position, so that when we come out of this situation that we have found ourselves in, we will go from strength to strength. And I hereby commit to calling it brand film as of today, forevermore. So I would like to thank everybody for joining us and for taking part. And I'd like to repeat my thanks to Patrick and James for joining in, and to Steve for putting what looks like a rather large amount of work into this report over the last year. And I thank you for sharing it with EVCOM. Good day to you all, and hope to see you all again soon. Bye for now.